3 or 2 now. Aoki documentary. But we'd like to open up to question and answers.
Comments, questions, anything? No.
What was yesterday's event like?
Yesterday's event was at the East Side Cultural Center. Was anyone there? Yeah, a few, right? It was packed. I don't know how many. I heard Eric say 250 to 300. It was standing room only. Every square inch of the floor was taken up. People could not come in the room. I mean, people couldn't even get in the door. And the Panthers who were there said very strongly, and many others who weren't on the panel also who spoke up, really defending Richard very vigorously. And the leader, Bobby Seale, said that as well. And so it was a moment of reclaiming history, I think, of reclaiming the kinds of attacks that are going on right now. Bobby Seale said something very interesting. He and Emory Douglas both talked about how the FBI would hound them and try to get them to, give them information and stuff. And Bobby Seale said that at one point Richard Aoki went up to him and talked to him about a concern he had. He said, the FBI keeps hounding me and I'm trying to get away from them. Just a very interesting piece of information.
Diane, if you could maybe give your assessment of, and I think you kind of touched upon it, just how insidious it was at that time in terms of the government and FBI coming after different people. There's the famous tapes of Malcolm X being confronted by the FBI. We know now that all the student groups have been infiltrated. What do you think was the main reason? What was the fear? And how deep did they go above and beyond the allegations of Richard? But what sort of, how hard were they trying to really flip things and disrupt stuff?
We now know, the activists didn't know it at the time, that the FBI had their counterintelligence program, right? Their Cointelpro. And the longtime FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said that he wanted to neutralize a possible black messiah, and that the vast majority of the Cointelpros were against the black movement. The vast majority of those were targeting the Black Panther Party. And we know that things happened that were very deadly. For example, in Chicago, there was an informer used to give information about the apartment layout for the Panther leader Fred Hampton. And the FBI did an early morning raid, shot tons of bullets into the apartment, and ended up killing Fred Hampton as well as Mark Clark. After that happened, the police tried to say that the Panthers fired out and that's why the police fired in. But in fact, possibly the one Panther who was supposed to be kind of, on security through the night, had fallen asleep, had a shotgun. His shotgun may have gone off, one bullet. But all of the other ones, they opened up the apartment and you could see all the bullets going inward at the Panthers. So we know that this kind of COINTELPRO actions had devastating effects. I've been hearing people say that Richard contributed. There's sort of this implication that Richard contributed. He almost initiated the gun patrols and the violence, directed back at the Black Panther Party. But this is, there's a long history. Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, Robert Williams in the South, who in Monroe, North Carolina in the late 50s armed the NAACP and took out a charter with the National Rifle Association. And so there's a much longer history. It didn't take a Richard Aoki, and the Panthers asked Richard Aoki for weapons for their police patrol to stop the greater violence of the police. But people have been saying that Richard Aoki, did these things, but there's no evidence about what he reported. There's no information about what he reported in those FBI documents, if anything, and if there was any kind of destruction as a result of his work.
Bobby Seale said something that was interesting in the FBI files that he had. He said that in those files, they weren't after the Panthers because of their guns, but they went after the Panthers because they were doing free breakfast programs and getting a lot of support.
Right.
And you keep hearing those stories over and over again that whenever people like yourselves and others were doing these community activities,
Right.
that's when the FBI really starts to become a problem,
Yeah.
you know, for everybody.
Well, the Black Panthers lived in my apartment during the Bobby Seale trial, and John Huggins was a friend of mine. You just told this story. His sister Erica Huggins was in bed in Chicago when her lover was killed, and John Huggins. I remember the last time I saw him, and he was killed in a shootout in L.A. that was fostered by the Cointelpro Dirty Tricks people throwing rocks back and forth. And during the Bobby Seale trial, the Panthers, everybody had boarded up the town because they thought that Panthers were going to burn it down. The Panthers were peacekeepers. They had walkie-talkies. Whenever there was any unrest, they would send a team out to chill it. But there were agent provocateurs there who were throwing rocks and bottles at the cops. And we knew some of them. We figured out who they were. So, you know, this was a very organized attempt to prevent any kind of enfranchisement of the disenfranchised in the society, running the society.
I just want to add something to you. When you start looking back what happened in 1969 and some of the insidious ways that Cointelpro worked, you got to look into Ron Karenga and the US organization who killed John Huggins and Bunchy Carter at UCLA in 1969. They were all used as a strike force against the Panthers, and they called themselves under the guise of cultural nationalists. But we know a lot now because I was there when that, you know, I didn't read about this, I was there. And the bottom line, I was telling students today, Ron Karenga operated at a place called the Hekalu, which was his temple, which was on 72nd and Broadway. 5 blocks from the 77 precinct, which is the most head-whippingest precinct in LA. How could you be revolutionary 5 blocks from the pigs? And that's just, you know, there's a lot of stuff that is still got to be unraveled around this, because when this thing broke about Aoki, it seems like it's more government trickery to discredit the people that really made a difference.
To follow up on what Bobby was just saying, some of the coverage that I was reading about, like the allegations around Aoki, were talking about how this was a classic FBI tactic, even in the past, to kind of allege that people were informants, as a divisive kind of a tactic. Could you talk about maybe things that you've come up in your research about ways that that's happened in the past? I know that I've read about writing fake letters signed fraudulently by different Panthers to other Panthers, trying to kind of do this kind of thing.
Right. This is exactly, and this is what I wrote in my San Francisco op-ed, right? That came out, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. I raised the question of whether this could be snitch-jacketing, right? Which was a tactic that the FBI used to foment dissent and distrust among activists. And they would try to discredit a legitimate activist. And it was very serious. They would send letters. Sometimes they capitalized on people's weaknesses. Like if a leader had a big ego, then they might try to, you know, say, oh, this other person is trying to take over your leadership, is challenging your leadership. But whatever they were doing, they were fomenting discord and distrust. The same thing happened with the